Do you ever feel like you are being pulled in many different directions as a leader specifically? Um, well, today I want to talk to you about the 4D leader. And no, I'm not saying 40 like the age or 4D like fourth dimensional, but rather I'm talking about the four directional leader. So I hope that you can learn something from this today. Stick around. Well, my name is Curtis, and I am a worship pastor in Overland Park, Kansas. And if you've been sticking with me thus far, probably already know kind of what I am about and my mission and my vision. My vision and kind of my why is to cultivate a thriving community where worshipers are raised up in character, competence, and cognitive health, really to help empower churches and colleges and communities. And so that's kind of the why, and the how that I plan to go about achieving or taking a directional approach for that vision is um, to create transformative content, provide coaching for worship leaders, and connect them to churches in need. So that transformative content, coaching, and connection is just the way I plan to go about that. And so, what I'm sharing with you today, this is actually a tool that I learned, or a variation of a tool I learned from my friends at Worship Catalyst. And a shout out to them if any of them that are watching this. I would highly recommend to go to their website and kind of get a feel for what they do. Great mission, and they're a great resource for the local church in all things worship. Highly recommend them. So they taught me this tool actually because I was tracking with them for a few years and I still have relationships with them. Um, but they taught me this tool that they entitled, if I'm not mistaken, the four conversations of a worship leader. And I'm going to briefly explain that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because what I'm wanting to share with you today is something I've kind of expounded. That was like a sounding board for me, and I kind of expounded upon that for a directional leadership tool. But like those four conversations were this: you have a vertical conversation, and let me preface this: the importance of this is these four conversations are happening every time you step up and lead worship from the stage, or whatever your expression of worship leading looks like. You have all four of these conversations playing out at once. And so you have a vertical conversation with the Lord, you have a horizontal conversation with your team members, with your band, you have a an outward conversation with whomever you're leading, your congregation or what have you. And then the fourth one is you have a inner critic conversation. So you have that voice inside your head, either maybe speaking pride or negativity in your ear. Like for me, how that played out is like I would see uh, a seasoned worship leader come in the room at times, and their voice in my head was saying, "Oh, you better watch how you play because if you mess up, they're going to see that." Or sometimes is like maybe you hit a note that you were like, "Oh, yeah, that note just happened," and so that prideful voice inwardly is like, "Ooh, I bet the audience really loved that note you hit." So those are the four conversations that is happening at every anytime you lead worship. And so I'm kind of taking that tool and I'm expounding upon that, and I'm calling this the four directional leader. And so what I believe is that if you make it a practice to grow in each of these areas that I'm going to share, you will become a complete worship leader. I firmly believe that. So let's start with the vertical leader. This is fairly self explanatory, but this is the importance of leadership as you are leading yourself and you're cultivating your relationship with the Lord. You can't, I believe this, and this is a common leadership um, statement, but you cannot lead people where you've not been yourself. And so, if we believe that in leadership and competencies, all the more so in our personal relationship with the Lord. If we are not going to the throne room and climbing the mountain, so to speak, what I mean by that is Jesus often withdrew from the crowds and got alone with the Father. That's what I mean by that. And so, if we're not cultivating that one-on-one personal private worship time with the Lord, then that plays into how we lead others. And so that vertical leader, it's spiritual growth as well as leadership growth. The one informs the other, the spiritual growth, the leadership growth. All right. So number two is the horizontal leader. And so if the vertical is the relationship with God primarily, horizontal leader, this is the relationship with our team. And so we all have teams in some way, shape, or form. If you are a leader, then it means you've been appointed to lead somebody. So that means you have a team. And if you are a leader and no one's following you, then that's a whole nother conversation. Like, then you need to take a really inward look at at your leadership if you've been appointed a leader and no one's following you. So that horizontal is the relationship you have with the people under you. And we believe that leadership is relationship. It's not a authority. Okay, so sometimes you have authoritative leaders, and then you have relational leaders. And I'm not going to dive into that, but I believe that relational leadership is key. That's how you're going to gain trust and lead people well the best, rather than just like pulling your boss card, if you will. Um, this is a good point right here in the horizontal leadership. How are we leading our team in spiritual and musical excellence growth? Okay. So we believe that Psalm 78:72. God took David, it says, from shepherding his sheep to shepherding God's people, and he did that with integrity of heart and a skillful hand. So what that means is that cultivating of the integrity of heart, that spiritual connection, that spiritual leadership, but also with skillful hand, that competence. So that's how I like to say it, character and competence. You've probably heard that anywhere. So, how are we leading our team, no matter how big, how small, in character and competence? And then I kind of expand that as I said in my mission statement or my vision statement, also cognitive health. But I'm not going to jump ahead because I kind of get to that here in a little bit. So, relationship with our team, how are we leading them um, in spiritual growth and musical excellence growth? And then playing in time. What I mean by that, I got pretty practical with that third point, um, is the importance of team in relationship to worship leadership from a Sunday morning expression. Okay, I'm getting really specific here. That is an element of this horizontal leadership because if we are not growing as a team, spiritually, but also musically, then what happens is you become a distraction for those you are leading. Okay, so those are the kind of the ways that I define horizontal leadership. Now let's talk about outward leadership. And this is your relationship with the congregation, just like the Worship Catalyst tool had a outward conversation. this is how I've expounded into this relationship with the congregation. So, meaning it's not just you and Jesus, it's not just you and your team and growing in your team, but let me break something to you in case you don't know this. You are a pastor. If you're a worship leader watching this, you are a pastor. Now, I don't want to sidetrack and get um, caught up in titles. I know sometimes you call them worship directors, music ministers, worship pastors. Uh, there's so many different titles that sometimes it gets confusing to who we are. But regardless of what they call you, you are a pastor. You have been anointed and appointed to pastor and shepherd not only your team, but a congregation. I think there's this misconception, and I talked about this in my episode, what worship leaders wish their pastors knew. And so you could go back and check that out. But I talk about how there's this misconception that the music leader, worship leader, is just to get up, lead the singing, and then let the pastor be the pastor and preach. But we are pastors as well. You are shepherding and pastoring pastoring your congregation. And I have countless stories here, but for sake of time I won't go into that. But um, I've sat with people in the highs and lows because they were a part of my flock. Not just because I'm only going to spend time with my music team, but I spent time and I spend time with the congregation because I am a pastor. And then lastly, oh, before I move on, another key component of this outward leadership, this outward with your congregation, is, man, we're at the forefront of engaging in spiritual warfare. Man, if you don't believe me, look up Second Chronicles 20. I know we probably all know that chapter, but the power of that chapter is like the people of God were faced with this insurmountable foe, if you will. And there's a process to what they did. They all fasted together, they prayed together, and then what happens is the Lord tells them through a prophet, send the worshipers out. So the worshipers go out leading congregational singing. And what happens is the Lord uses that as the tip of the spear to engage in spiritual warfare. And the enemy defeats themselves. They start fighting with themselves. And so, as an outward leader, you're responsible. And that's part of it, is to engage in spiritual warfare. Lastly, so you have the vertical, the horizontal, and the outward. Now we're going to look at the inward leader. And so this is something I like to call the imposter syndrome. Like, that's something that's very real. Kind of that inner critic that I was relating to or referring to earlier in regards to those conversations you're having as a worship leader, is that imposter syndrome, or that inner critic inside of you is super 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 powerful. It's sneaky. And what happens is this leads to insecurity. It leads to comparison. um, so it's not just a pride thing, like that's a distortion of it if we don't keep that inward leadership at bay, but it's also this negativity, insecurity, identity related um, thing that the enemy likes to kind of target and to get you where he can. All right. That's the enemy that is among us. Okay. And so for me, one of the things that it plays out for me is that comparison thing. Man, that's been so huge throughout my ministry. If I'm not careful, I get caught up in comparing myself to others. In Galatians 6:4, I believe it says, like, pay attention to your own work. Like, stop looking at others. Pay attention to your own work. All right. And so that's how we lead inwardly. And kind of circling back to the threefold that I try to focus on in my podcast here is that helping worshipers grow in character, competence, and cognitive health. That's where this cognitive health enters in, because if we're not like keeping our mental health as a forefront in our leadership and doing the things we need to keep that healthy and to keep focusing on the truth of who the Lord says we are, this is typically where that imposter and that inner critic will creep in, and it'll start burrowing these lies inside your mind, which can lead to all sorts of imbalances and depression and insecurity, and the list could go on and on. And so that's why I say it's super important to keep all these four areas in proper perspective and proper balance. What I mean by that is, if someone is super strong on that vertical relationship, what could happen is, yeah, you and Jesus are tight. What could be wrong with that, you might say? Well, the team that has been entrusted to you, how are you pastoring them? How are you shepherding them? If you are only concerned, how I would liken this, it's kind of like, the mental picture for me would be like, if I got up on a Sunday morning, I'm just using this as an analogy, have my guitar, and I just close my eyes and I just start worshiping the King. And sometimes I close my eyes, like, and I'm not getting into somatics here, but um, if I just close my eyes, worshiping the King, I can leave everybody else out, and it could lead to like, hey, how are we to participate in this? So I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. Is like, there's a balance. All of these four areas are super critical and they're crucial, but you have to keep them in the balance of how you're leading others. And so, as I wrap this up today, I would love to hear any comments or questions you might have, snide remarks. um, but kind of what my call to action for you guys would be, this is like, ask yourself two questions. Okay. If you were to do an assessment based on these four areas of leadership, what are the areas or area that you're the strongest in? Okay. Ask yourself that, kind of do an assessment. And then ask yourself, what is the area or the areas in which I'm weak in or I need growth in, and do an assessment with that. And man, if I could be a help in any way, I've been trying to get the word out recently. Like, I'm a resource here, and I've opened up some coaching spots, and I would love to set up a time where we could have a phone call or a Zoom call, or if you're in the Kansas City area, meet in person for coffee, and just kind of hear like, where do you need help? Like, what do you need growth in? And then see if I can help in any way. And I'm my goal is to provide 3 to 6 month coaching packages. And we could even go longer than that if we need to, but that's kind of where I'm starting. And basically, we would meet every week via Zoom or in person if you're local, and we would start walking through just these areas of emphasis, these four areas of spiritual leadership or of leadership. But then beyond that, there's musical excellence, there's administrative leadership, there's pastoral leadership, there's spiritual leadership, there's creative leadership. And I'm forgetting one. I always forget the sixth one. But so those are the things that I am passionate about, helping you grow in your growing your leadership lids, so to speak. So just send me an email at curtisbiswell@gmail.com. I'd love to have a conversation with you. So God bless. I hope this was helpful, and have a good rest of your week.